Hi. Today we're going to study Colossians chapter 3, verses 18 through chapter 4, verse 1. 4 verse 1 kind of goes with this. A crazy place where they divided the chapters there. But we finished off where Paul was giving some basic general rules for how we should live as Christians. And now he's getting a little more specific. He's talking about what a Christian household should look like. In the Roman culture, our Just Liz Tack in her teaching tonight, she pointed out that in a Roman culture, the men were the rulers of pretty much everything. You know, that song that it's a man's world, it really applied back then. Women were considered property. The wives were considered property. They were expected to obey their husbands with no questions asked. The children were the same way with their fathers, especially with their parents. They were just like a slave for the parents. And of course, slaves were considered part of the household too, and they were considered property. So each of these groups, you know, the husbands and the wives, the parents and children, the masters and the slaves, we see one group is an authority and the other group is under the authority. So that's what we're dealing with here. But you know, God said, you know, Paul already told us that in the Christian church, that there is no male or female, there is no slave or free, everybody is one. So how do you take that teaching and apply it to a Christian family? Because again, they have to live in this Roman culture where they are, where that is the Roman culture, that the man is the boss, you know, of everything. And the apostles' goal wasn't to radicalize the culture, wasn't to destroy the culture. It was to spread the gospel. So how do you take the idea that everybody is equal in the Christian church and apply that to the Roman culture's family? And that's what Paul's dealing with here. So I want to read you this verse out of the Message. It says here it is. I guess I have some notes beforehand about the family being the first institution that God set up. The breakdown of the home is a sign of the end times again. So their job, the disciples' goal wasn't to destroy the families back then. And so anyhow, the Message says, wives, understand and support your husbands by submitting to them in ways that honor the master. Husbands, go all out in love for your wives. Don't take advantage of them. Children, do what your parents tell you. This delights the master no end. Parents, don't come down too hard on your children or you'll crush their spirits. Servants, do what you're told by your earthly masters, and don't just do the minimum that will get you by. Do your best. Work from the heart for your real master, for God, confident that you'll get paid in full when you come into your inheritance. Keep in mind always that the ultimate master you're serving is Christ. The sullen servant who does shoddy work will be held responsible. Being Christian doesn't cover up bad work. And masters, treat your servants considerately. Be fair with them. Don't forget for a minute that you too serve a master, God in heaven. So we're going to go to verse 18. The NIV says, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now, Paul isn't being nasty to women and saying, you know, you need to, you know, obey your husbands and everything. This word for submit is really a military term that means to put yourself under another. In other words, she's to willfully do it. Now, this isn't how it has been up to this time. Before, she didn't have a choice. She just has to. But she is given a choice now, but she is still supposed to voluntarily submit. she's still supposed to submit to her husband. So her situation really hasn't changed as much as what her responsibilities are. She doesn't have anything added to it. But we're going to get into the instructions for the husband, and that's where things change a little bit. But there are three things to note here about the wife submitting. It says the context that we're studying, it shows that this wife's attitude is going to be prompted by her husband's unselfish love. If you know your husband loves you and is every decision he makes, he is considering you in it, you don't have trouble yielding to that because you know he's doing the very best he can with you in mind. He's not being selfish in the decisions that he makes. And when a wife knows that her husband loves her and puts her well-being at the forefront of every decision he makes, she has no trouble submitting to him. Secondly, again, like I said, the submission is to be voluntary. It's not forced on her by an overbearing husband. And it's the knowledge that there has to be a head of the household, and the Lord has set up the husband to be that. But again, that word is a voluntary submission. And it also says the submission is as is fitting in the Lord. It means it's not only the proper thing to do in the natural order, but it's also the proper thing to do in the Christian order. Now let's get to verse 19, where things really change. Again, the husband is the one with the authority, and up to this time, he could do anything he wanted with his wife. She was just a piece of property. She had to obey him. And there was one book that's in the Apocrypha, those extra books that we as Protestants don't recognize as authoritative, don't recognize as really part of God's word. But one of those books was written by a guy named Circa, and in it he stated that a silent wife was a gift from the Lord. Ha! Don't you love that? Poor Marty. He doesn't have a silent wife, that's all I'll say. And this guy, Sirach, went on to advise men that if she does not do as you direct, separate you from her, or separate her from yourself. Get rid of her. If she doesn't obey you, throw her out. Throw her out. Jesus and Paul's teachings elevated the status of a woman, because in verse 19 it says, "Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them." Love your wives. So it's changing the man's responsibility. Instead of seeing his wife as something that he owns, he's supposed to see her as a person, as a Christian sister. He's supposed to love her. There's another scripture that says that husbands are supposed to love their wives even as Christ loved the church. You think about how Christ loved the church. He died for the church. He did everything that he did for the church. He put the church before everything. And that's how the husband is supposed to be for the wife. So that changed completely. A lot of people think Paul, was really putting women down, that he hated women, because they didn't understand what this culture was back then. But really, Jesus's teachings and Paul's teachings elevated the status of women, teaching, again, the husbands that she's a person that you need to consider when you make your decisions. She's a person that you need to love. You need to put her needs ahead of your own. So Paul tells the men, husbands, to love their wives, not to be harsh with them. And in Ephesians, we talked about where he's to love his wife as Christ loved the church. Love here means a caring love, a deliberate attitude of mind that concerns itself with someone else's well-being. That's how that man is to love the wife. As the head of the house, he's to seek his wife's highest good, not his own welfare. And it talks about he's to honor her, be considerate of her, not be bitter or harsh. Harsh means an irritable attitude. always irritated, grumpy, grouchy. You're not supposed to be that way with your wife. And so again, there Paul isn't coming in here trying to change the society, but he is eventually changing it by getting men to recognize that women are people the same as them. And it might not be in the family that the wife can come in and be the boss and everything. She's still supposed to willfully submit. But when a man has shown that he loves her, that he cares about her, that he's going to put her needs, she has no trouble submitting to him. That's how a real Christian family is supposed to be. Not a man barking orders, but a man who cares about his wife, looks after her, determines what's best for her, and then she falls into obedience to him, submits to him because she knows that he cares about her. And then we're going to get to the children and parents. Verse 20 says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Again, they didn't have their responsibility changed at all. That was already their responsibility. In fact, children were considered property, just like the women were in this culture. They were considered slaves. The fathers could throw them in prison. They could sell them. They could even kill them with no questions asked because the kids were theirs. And there is a guy, let me try and say his name, Epictetus, who was a Greek philosopher. He was actually born a slave, but he was later freed. He lived between 50 and 135 AD, so he would have been alive when Paul was writing this letter. And he said this, again, this is a Greek philosopher. This is the culture of this day. He said the duty of a son is to treat everything that is his own as belonging to his father. He is to be obedient to his father in all things, never to speak ill of him to anyone else, nor to say or do anything that would harm his father, to give way to his father in everything and yield him precedence, helping as far as is within his power. So even after a child is grown, he is still to consider everything that he owns as belonging to his father. I need to call my kids. See if this will work now. But so again, it was accepted that children were to obey their parents. And Paul here teaches to obey your parents in everything that's not sinful, obviously. And that obeying, again, you hear the instructions, you carry them out. So again, Paul is speaking to a church here. He's speaking to Christian families, so it's expected that the parents aren't going to give them, instructions that are sinful, go do this, that's a sin. Paul's assuming that what they instruct their kids is going to be godly things. And so it pleases God when children fulfill this duty. So again, nothing has really changed for the kids. They're still supposed to obey their parents. But here's what changes in verse 21. Fathers, do not embitter your children or they will become discouraged. Again, before in this culture, a parent could treat his kids any way they wanted to. But now he's saying, don't be nasty to your kids. Don't embitter your children or they'll get discouraged. A parent should be careful not to discourage their kids, not to frustrate them. The rules that you have for your kids should be reasonable. And it says a parent should train the child the same way God disciplines and teaches us. That's how we should discipline our kids. Firm discipline may be necessary, but it must always be administered in the right spirit. Well, we can get into this discussion about discipline. I'm old school. Smack them when they need smacked, on their little behinds. And I used to have a wooden spoon. My kids still laugh about my wooden spoon, but they would get smacked on their little behinds when they didn't listen. So I believe in discipline, but I also believe that you need to do it in the right spirit, and that afterwards you come together, and bring that relationship back together. And parents shouldn't be always trying to find fault with their kids or always nagging at your kids. God's concern here was that the kids not become discouraged. I've heard it taught that you discipline them until their spirit is broken. I don't believe in that. I think we need to encourage the kids to be who they are, their own personalities. We should encourage them, help them to see their talents, their skills, their strengths, help them to recognize the gifts that God has given them. And then it goes on to the slave and master relationship. It says in verse 22, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, and there is no favoritism. So again, slaves are still expected to obey their masters, even in a Christian household. But what's different is in the Greek culture, you notice how Paul is telling them, do your best over and over. He says, do your best as unto the Lord. And the truth is that a lot of slaves back then, if the boss wasn't around, if their master wasn't around, you know, they didn't really care if they got the work done because it was no benefit to them to get the work done. They got no benefit. They didn't get paid extra. They got no pay whatsoever. They were property. And so a lot of times they weren't doing anything when the boss wasn't around. But when he would show up, then they would do what they had to do. And Paul's saying that's not right. When you're in a Christian household, if your master is going to the same church you're going to, is basically what he's saying, then you care about your master and you want your master to prosper, right? We care about each other. And so you do your very best to benefit your master, is what Paul is saying here. And we have to remember that slaves here, when we think of slaves in America, we think of, racial differences. But in Rome, more than half of the people in Rome cities were slaves. The majority of them were what we would consider professionals, like teachers or doctors. They were slaves. They belonged to the family. And so, again, Paul deals with slavery in the context of a Christian household. Again, the disciples weren't social reformers. Their goal was to get the gospel out here. But let me tell you, I think we can take a lot of these ideas and apply them to our jobs when we work for an employer. Now, I know it doesn't entirely correlate, because as an employee, we can always quit and go somewhere else to work. Our employer doesn't own us. But I think the idea of giving your best for your work, for your pay, applies here. I know some people, when the boss isn't around, they slack off at their job, and that's not right. I think we, as Christian employees, we need to be giving our very best, because we are still representing Christ in that work environment. And if people understand that we're a Christian and they see us slacking off and not doing our best, that's not a good witness. And that should be our goal, to be spreading the word of Christ, to be spreading the gospel, to be sharing it. And so we want to do our very best, just simply to protect our testimony. So let's go to I want to address verse 25. Anyone who does wrong will be paid for his wrong, and there is no favoritism. So Paul basically is telling the slaves here that God's not going to feel sorry for them and overlook what their misdeeds are, if just because they're treated unfairly, which some of them probably were. I'm sure they were. But so they were telling themselves, that, well, look how he's treating me. I'm going to do this, that'll fix him. Paul was saying, no, as a Christian, you still have to do what's right. And anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong. There's no favoritism. So Paul says, you still do what's right. And then we're going to get to chapter 4, verse 1, where it says, Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. So again, this is where it changes. The slaves didn't have their responsibilities changed. They were still expected to obey their masters, only now they're supposed to do their very best. So, I guess in a way, well, that shouldn't have changed anyhow. They should have been doing their very best. But what changes is how the masters were to treat their slaves. They weren't supposed to treat them as a piece of property anymore. They were supposed to treat them right. They were supposed to give them what was right and what was fair. And employers now should be paying a fair wage. But Paul's telling these masters, you have a master too. And he's watching, he sees what you're doing. He sees if you're treating your slaves right. So again, this is what changed. And you have to realize too that in a church situation, again, these masters and slaves were going to the same church. And in a church, it didn't matter if you were a master or if you were a slave. You were treated equally in the church. And the slave could have been a leader in the church, that the master was sitting under the slave in the church. So things were different. So that's where society eventually did change through Christianity, because these people before who had the authority, the husbands, the parents, the masters, they had to learn to see these other people who were under them as people and not just as property. They had to recognize that these people were equal to them, that God saw them all as equal. And that's what eventually got rid of slavery in the world. Christianity, that's not what, we look at this and we say, well, Christianity is saying it's okay. Christianity God never said it was okay to have slaves. He never said it was okay to be nasty to your wife. God never approved of any of this stuff. That was the culture. But Christianity did eventually change that culture. So again, there's three basic principles we need to learn. We need to focus, number one, we need to focus on our responsibility in the relationship. Whether you're the husband, the wife, whether you're the parent, the child, whether you're the slave or the master, Paul gives each party a responsibility. And if we are the authority, we have to treat the others fairly. And if we are under the authority, we need to obey. And number two, there are going to be times when you have to die to yourself and serve the other person. We don't always get what we want. We need to have the mindset that it's not about me, about what I deserve or what I can get, but it's about what I can give. And that applies to whether you're the authority or under the authority. And then number three, as Christians, whether you're the authority or under the authority, what you do for the Lord, not for men. So we're to do our very best, no matter what we do, we're to do our very best as if we're doing it unto Jesus. And I'll close with that. Thanks.